All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate it. A huge thank you to our facilitators today, Denise Williams, Scott Rasmussen, and Jeffrey Blackwell. We're very appreciative to have you guys here and really looking forward to the session. As always, if you have any questions during this session, we really encourage you to participate. So please feel free to just either raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask a question, or send a message in the chat, either to a facilitator, myself, or to the whole group, and we'll be sure to answer your question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators, and thank you very much in advance for a great session.
Katie, I don't remember what order we're going in.
Oh, are we starting up? Sorry, I didn't know if there was somebody else who was going to moderate and try to give brief introductions.
No worries. Yeah, Scott, do you want to kick us off and just give a brief intro to yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Scott. I currently actually work for the state of New York on mostly rural broadband, but also cellular issues. My past is working on Capitol Hill, where I actually had the great privilege of working with a number of tribes in Northern California on a variety of telecommunications issues, but really focused on telecom on Capitol Hill. And I'm currently involved with a community network here in New York City that's trying to make fast and affordable broadband available to everybody in New York. Should I get started, or should everybody else introduce themselves?
Why don't you go ahead and get started, and then as each one goes through their presentation, we'll let them do an intro too.
Great. All right, then I will get my presentation up here. So as I mentioned, my name's Scott, and really what I'm going to be talking about today is very much, I think, at a granular level, some of the issues that I work with on a daily basis. As I mentioned, I'm part of an organizer with an organization called NYC Mesh here in New York City. That operates in many ways like a wireless ISP. However, we're a nonprofit community network, and I think that really differentiates kind of our model and the work we do and how we try to go about doing it. So fundamentally, we're a community-owned and managed network, and I'd love just kind of the opportunity to talk a little bit about what types of policies we have, how we operate, the work that we do here in the city, with the hope that we may be able to share some of our successes and failures with all of you as you may try to begin wireless ISPs or community networks or other sorts of efforts to try to connect the unconnected, or at least provide your communities with greater control and sovereignty over your telecommunications systems. So just to begin, here's my presentation outline so you get a kind of sense of what I'll be talking about today. I really want to go into detail, as I said, on NYC Mesh and the work that we do so that you can really hopefully use our work as a model for your own. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of an overview about who we are, what we do, as well as our organizational structure, so you can kind of understand how at least we've decided to organize ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the successes and failures we've had there. I'm also going to try to go into enough detail that we can really talk about some of our day-to-day operations and what it actually looks like every day for us to be operating here in the city. And then I'll discuss a little bit of the tech side as well as our financials, because I think that all of that just helps to provide some helpful context to everybody about, in our case, exactly how little money it takes to be able to get started and working on this. And then I'll try to just share some of the key challenges we've had internally as well as externally from the city or other sorts of regulatory agencies. And so that's my kind of plan and outline for the presentation. Before I move ahead, with that said, I'm kind of curious if any of the participants in the group or co-facilitators have any kind of questions or things that they'd love for me to be able to try to include to cover, or that I could try to bring out throughout the presentation when talking about a community network that's certainly operating in an urban space, but just any kind of challenges that you guys have kind of encountered or discussed previously that I could potentially help shine some light on. All right, I will take that as no, but by all means, please feel please feel free to be able to chime in with any questions or interrupt me while we're going. I'll apologize in advance if anything I say lacks clarity for some reason. I had an emergency red eye last night, and so I'm operating on a little less sleep than I would have hoped for this presentation. So if I need to repeat anything or clarify something further, please just jump in. So without further ado, what is NYC Mesh? We're a nonprofit, we're entirely community owned, and we really believe that the internet is for everybody. We wholeheartedly embrace ISOC's kind of mission statement on that front. And we provide business, we don't really discriminate at all about who we're providing access to. In many cases it's homes, but we also provide access to businesses, to entire buildings, whether they're a community center or an entire low-income housing development or anything else. And our overall mission is to create an open, resilient, neutral network here in New York City that's accessible and affordable to all New Yorkers. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what we mean by affordable. Here's just a couple of our principles and kind of how we guide our own work. We really believe it's important to be accessible, that our network should be neutral, and as we kind of see policies across the country being implemented at a state level on net neutrality without the absence of federal leadership, something I'm sure Jeff could talk much more about. We also believe in being fast, that people need to be able to use the network for anything that they may need. Resiliency is a major issue here in New York City, particularly after Hurricane Sandy. The city actually invested about $2.2 million in Sandy relief funds to try to fund mesh networks much like ours. Unfortunately, we weren't in a position to be able to apply for any of those funds since that was a bit earlier than we kind of came onto the scene. But nonetheless, there are other mesh networks in New York that really do focus predominantly on resiliency issues and what to do in major storms, other national disasters. We believe in empowering everybody in our community, and ultimately we believe that our network is ours and should be run by the members and people who use it. And I guess one thing to share on that is we've done a lot of work and internal work to decide what a member means and what it is to be a participant in our community network. And we've really embraced a definition that's as broad as possible. So it can be anyone from somebody who has home Wi-Fi using our network, or somebody who uses maybe a cell phone in a street to be able to access our open wireless network that we have throughout the city. So very briefly, just to give a sense of history, I think the most important thing that I wanted to highlight here is that you'll note in 2016, it says the fifth and final failure. The real issue that I want to drive home here is that our community network has started and stopped multiple times. We have had many failures over the years. There's times when it just kind of petered out and people were no longer using it, and then 5 months later, a volunteer would try to get things started again. And so I really want to kind of highlight that as saying that, and I'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, but start small, start now is kind of what we've been thinking about and with respect to community networks, and not being afraid to fail. A lot of these things take a lot of time to be able to get off the ground, and it's only been in the last 2 years, notably since we actually got some financial support from ISOC and through their Beyond the Net grant to really be able to kick things into gear and take our work to the next level. This is just to be able to help everybody understand what our network looks like. This is Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, which is predominantly where we're located. We are expanding into Queens now and have some efforts to expand there. But the large blue dots are what we kind of describe as super nodes, which basically means fiber connected nodes on the network. We actually have an internet exchange point there in Lower Manhattan. You can see right by New York, it kind of says by Battery Park. We actually operate out of an internet exchange point there. But these are all these lines represent wireless connections that we have across the network. The red dots are just kind of individual end users. The lighter blue tends to be kind of neighborhood hubs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's the image on the left there. On the right is all the gray dots represent potential nodes. So those are people throughout New York City that have signed up to try to host a node. And so you can see we really have our work cut out for us. We have about 3,500 nodes right now, and this kind of helps, or requested nodes, 4,500, sorry, requested nodes, and we're about now at this point receiving 50 requests a week, and we're doing 6 installs a week, and I'll talk a little bit more about what an install means for us. So real brief, to just take a step back and looking at what our structure is. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit. We have a board of directors, but our board of directors is as inactive as humanly possible. And why I think that that's important to note is that we really try to maintain a very fluid and dynamic structure. We really want our community to very much represent the decentralized nature of our network. And we've really found that that's a preferable model, not just because people burn out and somebody else needs to tap in and take over, but it also allows us to be able to harness energy that our community has and train new leaders and bring people in quickly and give them opportunities to be leaders and get involved in other ways. It helps us to be able to adapt to a very changing city landscape. If we suddenly have a new connection in an area and are filling out quickly, we can immediately get individuals in a new area of our city connected, but also involved in becoming active leaders in the organization. You know, some of the challenges that we've had with that, just to try to help clarify so you can, you know, hopefully understand some of the issues we've had, is definitely that in that context, knowledge equals power. And so when you have a network that's really driven by human relationships, that can kind of create informal routes of power within an organization. And we've really tried to make an express effort not to allow that to be able to change the direction, and really to decentralize and create transparency wherever we can. And then overall, I guess the other most important part of our structure is that we spend all of our time in meetings. So every week we have multiple ongoing meetings. Once a month we have an organization meeting where everybody in our community is invited to come participate. We have a couple standing committees there. We have people who give presentations. You can actually see in this photo here is Pete, one of our members, giving a presentation. On the far right, you can see a meeting. Actually, that's a photo of our install leaders, so individuals who may show up to somebody's home to be able to install home internet. We have trainings and facilitation that we have every week. Actually, I'm realizing that I skipped a slide here, so I'm just going to throw this up. I won't talk much about it, but just kind of giving an overview of what we kind of view as our work. So it's not just connecting individuals. We're also very passionate about education and about partnerships and leadership development in our community. We are very much census-based, mission-driven, so we've really found that focusing on our mission as an organization and not involving anything else has been really successful with us in terms of being able to tackle ongoing issues. And being consensus-based means that we move in a way that everybody's excited about and has a say and ability to be involved on issues. So we rarely have things like votes in our organization. It's really generally based on meetings, consensus, hashing out plans, presentations. Everybody in our community is invited to be able to lead an initiative, to propose an initiative, and we try to create a forum and space for people to be able to do that and then generate the consensus they need to be able to move forward. Some of our day-to-day operations, I think the key things here, and I want to share some of these details because I think it's really helpful to see some of the nuts and bolts, and I'm by all means happy to kind of talk offline with anybody afterwards about exactly some of the work we do on a kind of day-to-day basis and the systems that we use, from OS Ticket to Slack. Most of our work actually takes place on Slack. That's what we use to be able to organize our community and communicate on a daily basis. Again, we have in-person meetings and events, and those may be meetings, but often are educational workshops. So we try to every month host 2, maybe 3 even educational workshops that try to expand our community in some ways and kind of build our core competencies amongst our membership. So we may have a presentation one week on fundraising and grant workshops, and then the next week on GitHub and how to edit our website, and the next week on QuickBooks and how to get involved in that. And so we really think that doing all of this kind of educational programming allows us to be able to involve everybody in their community. I do want to ask some questions. is it possible to just kind of do a check-in from everybody as to whether this is a helpful kind of direction that we're talking about? If there's other sorts of aspects of some of our operations or structure that may be helpful for me to be able to cover a little bit further.
So Scott, you've actually got a question in the chat, and I'll read it for you. It says,
that would be great. Yeah, I don't know how to pull that up on the full screen.
No worries. It says, can you give us some examples of partnership and leadership development training or education?
Sure. So, let me get actually just to our next, let me skip ahead a little bit here. We have a number of kinds of ways that we try to foster leaders in our community, and that's really by, in one respect, trying to do that education component. Everybody brings to our community a skill set and has skills in various types of areas that I think are really relevant to everybody in our community. And so we try to invite people to put on workshops or trainings that may be relevant to their skill sets, so that we can kind of try to educate everybody and get everybody up to speed on these issues. So if we have somebody enter our community with, let's say, experience in fundraising, we may ask them to lead a workshop on fundraising and consider doing that. Or if we have somebody in our community with a tech skill that we think may be relevant or important, we may do that. And then we actually generally invite other nonprofits or organizations to attend and participate in those workshops as well, which we think really gives us the opportunity to be able to kind of expand our community, involve new folks, but also kind of wrap other folks into our work. And then another way that we try to do leadership development that I think is something that we've really been working hard on is by creating kind of mini mesh communities. And so here I just kind of pulled this up as an example of a model that we did. This is a small couple of blocks you can see in New York. Here's another kind of example of a block. This is actually the Jefferson Block Association that we did a partnership with. And so we've been trying to work with kind of small neighborhood organizations or even just one block at a time and try to connect with people in that very small space. Because by creating kind of these mini meshes or smaller spaces to be active in, it really allows us to be able to elevate individuals to be leaders in their own community that may not, be participants in NYC Mesh broadly, but may have a lot of interest in making sure that their blocks and their neighbors and other people on their block are connected. And so we try to create opportunities to elevate folks in that space as well. Does that help answer the question? I hope
I think yes, but there is a follow-up to it and asks, is the training online or in person, or is it blended?
We do both. And so certainly whenever we're doing something online, we'd absolutely welcome folks here to be able to participate. You can always email me and try to ask what our schedule may be looking like. We try to do as much as we can in person, but we also generally live stream as many of our workshops as we can where it's feasible, to try to make sure that we have recordings and everyone's involved.
Thanks very much.
So just as a quick outline, here's kind of what some of our installs look like. These are larger hubs, just to get a sense of what it may look like. I'm not sure how to, my apologies that I may be missing the chat here. So here's what some of the installs. Katie, would you mind doing me the big favor, and if something pops up in the chat, just kind of interrupting if somebody has not?
Yes, and there is a quick note that just says that it's really awesome that you guys do it that way, because I think this group is particularly interested in participating, and maybe not everyone can come in person, but the live streaming would be great to share. Yeah,
wonderful. And so here's just an example I wanted to outline, just so that you can see physically what an install looks like, what it looks like when we're putting equipment on somebody's roof. Most of the equipment that we use, I'd be more than happy to discuss offline or later with anybody about what our equipment is. It's also all available on our website. It is all off the shelf, relatively cheap equipment. Certainly some antennas can become more expensive in the $3,000 range to do kind of gigabit point-to-point connections, but most of what we install on a daily basis is $60 antennas or $100 antennas or something that may be in that price range. So these are kind of an example of larger, what we'd call neighborhood hubs, or things that we would put up in an area to be able to connect like an entire block, like what I was showing before. So maybe usable for 15 or 20 or a few more users. Each of these sectors here, actually, in the middle shot here, is capable of doing connecting about 15 to 20 units. This is what much more a single person's block rooftop may look like. We have just kind of a light beam, which is a Ubiquity product. That's about a $60 antenna that we can put on somebody's roof. We've actually moved to installing those in conjunction with what our OmniTix, which is a MikroTik product, a company out of Latvia, I believe, that actually allows for, it actually rebroadcasts out the internet. So the smaller kind of point-to-point antennas here, point-to-multipoint antennas, like these light beams that's featured in the top right there, really just allow us to be able to connect one person at home. But we've really taken to a model of trying to have that, if you're connected, you're also going to share the internet with the people around you in your community. And that's what's kind of allowed us to move towards this kind of very hyper-localized model that I think really helps us to be able to foster local leadership, but also get people more excited because they're working with their neighbors. People inevitably tend to care and get more involved with their neighbors. Just to be, so that I'm not talking too much, here's just a quick outline of kind of what our install team and process looks like. I won't go into more detail here to save everybody on the time, but our organization also does a lot of software and firmware development. We have a line of sight tool that anybody can log on, enter their address, and find out immediately whether they have a line of sight to any of our hubs and be able to connect online. We also have a hardware configuration generator, which is kind of a wonky sounding thing, but really allows anybody to be able to log on, put in the equipment that they have, and download everything that they need, including instructions to be able to set that equipment up for themselves. So we do lots of training where we try to encourage and teach people in person how to do that, but we also try to make our best effort to make sure that everybody, all the technology that we use, everything that we do in our community is accessible to everybody, that everybody can understand what's going on and then understand ultimately how to do it themselves, because that's how we kind of believe in having equity in our space. So we have the Network Commons license, and you'll even notice that the second bullet point there, this is what everybody signs up when they join. Second bullet point says participants are free to know how the network and its components function. And this is basically the agreement that we have everybody when they join our community sign on to. And it's really just saying that they're going to share their connection with others in the same way that it was shared with them. And some stuff about having access and knowledge as to how the network is run. Just real quick as financials, because I think it's important to kind of give context to this. Our entire organization runs on $3,800 a month through kind of subscriptions. So whenever we connect somebody online, we ask that if they're able to afford it, that they contribute $20 a month to kind of a membership of sorts. I keep using the word membership, but I think that we don't often use that term. But I think that just in trying to explain it, I'm using the term a lot. But we generate about $3,800 a month in revenue from voluntary contributions. So nobody in our community is required to pay. About 60 to 70% of our community decides to make a monthly contribution to the organization. The other 30-40% pay nothing. And we don't discriminate against anybody based on what their ability to pay is. We don't think that that should be relevant as to whether you have a home internet connection or not. So a lot of our work is often communicating to individuals what it is that their money's going to when they make kind of a voluntary contribution. So I've put a little bit of information on the left there about what some of our equipment costs. That's basically the kind of price range we're usually looking at when we're deploying equipment. And then we rent 2 rooftops in New York, and that costs us about $1,700 a month. Everything else is sunk into trying to subsidize equipment and installs for people who may not be able to afford it. So that's a kind of outline of our budget. As you can see here, it's actually, it's not too huge. We basically operate as much as we can through donated bandwidth from folks, and going back to our internet exchange point, I could talk a lot more about that, but we'll save you from it now. But I'm happy to talk later about it a bit more. Some of our external challenges that we have in the city, siting. I missed it. I don't want to skip. So our internal challenges I mentioned earlier. So this kind of highlights some of those. These are on the left are kind of decision making and volunteer engagement and cultivation, things we do. And then I've kind of drawn arrows over to the right about some of the solutions that we've kind of tried to implement. I mentioned, we do have a board of directors. We try not to use it in any circumstances and really operate through organization meetings. We try to create pipelines and education for everybody in our community so that people have the opportunity to present. As I was just mentioning, at that organization meeting that we had, our most recent organization meeting, the guy Peter, who I had noted down in that photo, had never been in public, had never engaged in public speaking before. And we really try to encourage everybody to kind of take on those kind of roles and create a safe space for people to try new things and take risks and actually grow as, not just members of our community, but in their own personal development. These are some of the other issues that I think that, I don't want to take too much time. I'm trying to keep it to under 25 minutes here, so I'm in my last minute or two, I believe. But this kind of outlines, I think, some of the challenges that we've really been thinking about. And then there's external challenges, of course. Siting and city topography. We live in a city with tons of skyscrapers, and we have to find our ways to navigate around them in the topology of our landscape. But it would be the same in any other sort of landscape. You have to consider the obstacles, physical and otherwise, that may exist. We have municipal regulation, which is actually pretty limited in New York for the most part. We operate entirely under any kind of regulatory authority. New York City probably hardly knows that we exist in most cases. Internet as a service, I just wanted to highlight that because a real challenge that we have is making sure people think deeply about where their internet comes from, communicating. A lot of folks think of the internet as like getting your gas or water bill, and it's just it may be something that you pay or think about, but really trying to involve folks and being active participants in that is often a kind of challenge. Legitimacy is always an ongoing issue for us. We're a ragtag bunch of volunteers that are, for the most part, making it up as we go along. Sometimes it can be hard to be taken serious in a room or with government bureaucracies and that. And then my final slide here is just, I wanted to drive home, put this up. I don't have to touch on every one of these, but here's some of the takeaways that we've kind of had. And the first one there, I just really want to urge everybody is start small and start now. We started with somebody purchasing a Verizon business line and sharing that connection with their neighbors with a small antenna router in their house, with actually a bar nearby, and kind of expanding from there. There are a lot of ways to be able to start at a very small and simple level that starts building the movement and building volunteers and participants and community members, that really things can begin snowballing. So I would really suggest just doing whatever you can to just get that first step and start building from there. As I mentioned, we've failed 5 times, so feeling free to accept failure. And using reliable, boring technology, and then a level of localism, I think, would be the last that I'd highlight. It's really important for us to be able to create these local communities. We really operate with person-to-person relationships, and that's always easier to foster and cultivate when you're talking about one city block or one small neighborhood or one small community. And then ultimately creating leadership opportunities for everybody in our space. With that is the end of my kind of presentation, and I think we're going to be hanging out to be able to do some questions later on. So I will leave it there, and I believe, Denise, I think I'm handing it off to you.
Before you go, I just want to say thank you so much, Scott. That was fantastic. And I want to take a quick minute to check and see if there are any questions now, just before we move on, so that people don't forget by the end. So if anyone has a question for Scott, please feel free to put it in the chat now, and we'll wait for 30 seconds or so. And actually, Scott, you've got a question already. It says, at what speeds are the hub/backbone versus what their users receive? Oh, so what is the difference in speed between the hubs and the backbone
Sure.
and users get?
It drops off. We're doing an install-a-thon this week, actually, in coordination with ISOC. And we've set up 2 kind of neighborhood hubs. There's 21 apartments on the block that we're trying to, connect. And the connection speeds that we have at the hubs are about 100 megabits per second down and 30 to 35 up. And we're pretty confident that that'll be fine to be able to cover, that entire city block with a high-speed connection. So those individuals at home through that hub, maybe getting somewhere 40 to 60 range, probably. It doesn't, in theory, it kind of halves, but it often doesn't because of, some kind of tech that's above my pay grade to be able to talk about. But, I think half plus a little bit is generally a good estimate per hop that you may have. So each one of those hops may, half and a little bit more. So our home speeds for most folks, we won't install in somebody's home if it's really under 25 down or something like that, which is kind of in line with what the FCC describes as high-speed broadband.
Thanks. And you've got one more question so far.
Sure.
Says, can you talk a little bit about how NYC Mesh works with the Internet Exchange? Or if you have more resources, it might be great to put some in the chat while the others are presenting too, so that we can record them.
Yeah, sure. And very briefly, there's about 7 or 8 we are blessed in New York City to have 7 or 8 local internet exchanges. One of which is in Lower Manhattan in a large data center where we were actually able to get some space donated by a company called DKEX, which is a German-based company that operates internet exchange points globally. And we started out about 2 or 3 years ago. We were able to get their interest, and they donated a 1 gigabit connection to their internet exchange point. So in there, we were able to peer with other networks from Google to everybody else you could kind of imagine, and that kind of gave our users access to the wider internet. And for us, really ensured that we were able to offer a truly net neutral connection, a connection that our members and our community entirely controlled from end to end, at least within that kind of last mile of New York City. And I'm happy to share more about it and kind of follow up what our experience and how our work on that has been.
Thanks very much, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we've got a little lull in questions, so I think let's turn the floor over to Denise. And if anyone has additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat now and we can save them for later, or directly message them to Scott. And Scott, now that your chat is up, you'll be able to respond that way. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody. Just want to thank everybody for joining and acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which everyone is joining the call today. I'm joining from unceded Coast Salish territory in British Columbia, Canada. And I'm myself from Cowichan Tribes, which is on Vancouver Island, pretty large island off of British Columbia. But my office here is on Squamish Tsleil-Waututh territory in North Vancouver, British Columbia. And I'm the CEO of the First Nations Technology Council, which I'm just going to tell you a little bit about today and tell you a little bit about our journey and the kind of work we're doing to ensure that Indigenous peoples have equal, affordable, sustainable access to digital connected technologies, and to ensure that we are the authors of our digital sovereign future, and share with you a little bit about the challenges that we've had lifting our voices at all different levels of government and ensuring that our desire for the design of technologies, the networks that are implemented in our communities, serve not only people now, but in 7 generations to come. And welcome questions all along the way. And I hope sharing our experience is useful for you. Now let me make sure I know how to make this work. So a little bit about the First Nations Technology Council. We were actually given our mandates from First Nations leadership in British Columbia in 2002. So the BC Assembly of First Nations, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and the First Nations Summit are comprised of 203 First Nations communities in British Columbia, which culminate in a leadership body that gives us our marching orders as First Nations service organizations. So the First Nations Technology Council is a First Nations service organization, one of about 26. So ranging from forestry, fisheries, mining, education, healthcare, childcare. We, of course, are the technology organization, so play a role underpinning the success of all of our sister councils across British Columbia. So, of course, in 2002, when we were given these mandates to ensure that all 203 communities in British Columbia and over 250,000 Indigenous people here in BC have connectivity, access to digital skills development, information management, and technical services and support. In 2002, that looked a lot different than it does in 2019. In my role now at the Technology Council, I've been here for 7 years, and a lot of my role has been to figure out what the strategic plan for the organization is, what our value proposition is to those 203 nations and to urban Indigenous people as well, and to build a sustainable business plan because we are an unfunded, not-for-profit organization. So we really have to hustle to be here and to run the programs and meet the mandates that we've been given by our leadership. So one of the early lessons that we had is that we can't do it alone. So back in 2002, our little not-for-profit was trying to achieve all of those mandates as a service provider, building services and products to meet the needs of First Nations communities. One of the things that we found out really early is that wasn't the best way forward. So what we've become is a provincial and in some ways a national convener. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about our Indigenous framework for innovation and technology coming up in a couple of slides. But that framework comes out of the learning that we've had, that when we bring together all levels of government, academia, industry, with community partners, with First Nations communities, and with all Indigenous peoples, we can start to solution for the right thing. So we spend a lot of time convening different groups around looking at different policies that we can build together, looking at different strategic frameworks, implementation plans that can take our 203 nations from where we are now to better connected, better informed, and making better decisions about our future. So one of the cornerstones of the First Nations Technology Council that has brought us forward into 2019 in terms of our funding is we've raised quite a bit of money for digital skills development. This is what we're most well known for in the province of British Columbia and across Canada. We've had about 3,000 Indigenous people through our digital skills development training, which are mobile labs that travel around to communities. So 90% of people who take our training take it in their community or within 10 kilometers of their community, which is really important to us. And what we've done is we've participated in a number of different labor market development programs across BC, understanding what the future of the tech and innovation sector in BC is going to look like. And one of the things we've heard is that there's going to be a lot of, they call them talent shortages in BC to fill tech jobs in the sector. And one of the things the Technology Council is trying to say is that there's not a lack of talent, there's a lack of investment in talent that already exists in British Columbia. And so some of the thinking is how do we ensure that people from underrepresented groups, that's the provincial government language, are participating in the tech ecosystem, in the tech sector, looking at the participation of women, peoples with disabilities, newcomers to Canada, and Indigenous people. And so one of the early lessons was that Indigenous people really, we don't have a lot of data to show of the over 250,000 Indigenous people in this province, how many would be able to move into the tech sector, interested in moving into the tech sector, and what kind of skills are needed to move folks into that, into those careers. So what the Technology Council has done is build the very first sector labor market program, taking a look at how many Indigenous people have the interest and ability to move into the sector. And we built a program called Foundations and Futures in Innovation and Technologies to start attracting those people to investigate the sector. And important to say, not just looking into and getting interested in joining mainstream tech and innovation in British Columbia, but also growing local digital economies as well. So Foundations and Futures in Innovation and Technology raised $7.1 million about 2 years ago from the federal government. We've had 200 students through it, and we've had Indigenous, we've hired a group of Indigenous curriculum writers to take a look at the modules that we are presenting to our students that are tech relevant modules, and indigenize them, contextualize them, localize them. As a result of that, and I think a lot of our Indigenous mentorship and our digital elder Glida, who joins classes and works with our students throughout their time with us, we do have an 86% completion rate. We are planning on having about 200 students over the next 2 years, but we've just received a little bit more funding to take all of our programming online, so that all of our students will be able to access our courses without having to be in the classroom face-to-face for 12 weeks. So Foundations and Futures is a 12-week long program, like I say, online and in person, that helps Indigenous people to see all of the different job opportunities and in some way kind of try them out. And once they graduate, they have the opportunity to move into the sector, into internships. So this is just a little bit about the career paths that the Technology Council, through Foundations and Futures in Innovation and Technology, this is the pathways that we're navigating people through. Each of these are modules within our program, and we're just adding drones to this. Our long-term vision is that we'll be building modules that match economic growth opportunity across the province, looking at, specifically in British Columbia, we have certain regions that are being invested in by our provincial and federal governments in areas like fintech, aerospace, agritech, and we want to ensure that we're mapping Indigenous communities, overlaying our territories and those opportunities that are being built in those regions, to ensure we can build modules into our program that ready our people to be competitive in those sectors. So these are our modules right now, but we're going to be designing a lot more in the future. One of the reasons that this program is so important to us is because Canada's digital economy is growing faster than every other aspect of any other area of the economy. And so in British Columbia, the tech sector is outgrowing forestry, fishing, mining, oil and gas, all combined. So it's employing more people, it's growing more rapidly, and we know that growth is going to be sustained. And unfortunately, although 1.4 million Canadians in 2018 are employed in the digital economy, we know that it's less than 1% identify as Indigenous. So like I say, when the country is thinking about needing to build talent in this area to fill job shortages, and Indigenous people make up less than 1% of the sector, that's where the Technology Council's value proposition is in building this kind of Indigenous-led programming to have more of our people represented. This is obvious to everybody, probably on this call. We know that the use of technology is going to be required, is required now, is going to be more required for participating in the economy. And one of the things that's so important about raising this for us in British Columbia is that less than 75% of our First Nations communities in BC are connected to high-speed internet. So how are our people going to get the experience and the skills to participate in the economy and in a connected society if 75% of them don't have access to basic broadband internet or affordable internet? So we talk a lot about, given that some of our nations, a lot of our nations don't have this basic access. At the same time, all these different technologies are transforming the way that we work and the way that we are together and the way that we participate in the world. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about at the Technology Council is how that digital divide is affecting Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and how the socioeconomic gap is affected more and more by the disparity. So this is what I was just talking about. Here in BC, our geography is such that we've got a lot of small communities scattered around BC. The cost to connect those communities by large telcos is higher than what their return on investment allows for. So in BC, we're actually asked to create a business case for First Nations, for telecommunications companies to actually build the infrastructure into the communities. That's why it's 75% of us don't have that access because we don't have the business case. So as a result, we're looking at how to negotiate across multiple jurisdictions, municipal governments, provincial governments, and federal governments, trying to wave the flag to say that this is a real issue, and we're so far behind on investing in a comprehensive way that what we're seeing is fewer and fewer Indigenous communities meeting that definition of connected. So our solution to this is to build an Indigenous framework for innovation and technology. So important to say, not just a framework, but an implementation plan as well. One of the reasons for this is that in Canada, there's large envelopes of funding to connect communities, to connect Indigenous peoples. But like I say, in British Columbia, with 200 independent nations, we're not well coordinated on how to take advantage of these envelopes of funding coming from different levels of government and from the tech sector itself. So how do we organize ourselves to ensure that moving forward, we as Indigenous people have a unified framework for how we'd like to see the distribution of those funds, and that we have our own theory of change for how we'd like to see networks built, applications built, and really taking leadership of the evolution of technology in our communities. So we started to build, this is really small, we've started to build the framework out, and we've actually done a number of regional sessions across British Columbia, asking Indigenous peoples about their experience with technology, about that intersection of culture, language, healthcare, education, from a community-based perspective, and how they see technology as a platform, a supportive tool, or in some cases as a detractor from community culture tradition. And so we've been on this learning journey for a couple of years, and what we've come out with for the framework are kind of these 6 slices of the pie that you're seeing there. And what we're trying to do is to to have something on the table that's built by Indigenous people, that we can go to all levels of government and say, this is the playbook for how we'd like to see technology implemented in our communities. Here's the policies we need to review or to change to make all of this possible. And here's how we see digital and connected communities playing a role in for our people in the future. And so each of these slices of the pie, what we'd like to do is full research using our Indigenous research methodology into each of these areas to understand what data do we have now to benchmark where we are, and then what conversations do we need to have with community to come up with the implementation, the action plan moving forward for each of these areas, and who needs to be involved, and how do we start building committees, working groups, and how do we get commitment from all levels of government to start investing into this framework, into the implementation plan, so that on an ongoing basis, we won't have to do what we've had to do for the last 20 years in British Columbia as Indigenous people, which is to continuously be submitting proposals to government for tiny bits of funding that will never solution the problem. So this framework has become a real focal point for the First Nations Technology Council and for our First Nations Leadership Council as well. From our perspective, it hasn't. It really hasn't been doable without this framework, because every time we talk about connectivity, we're talking to different ministers within the government, so kind of being ping-ponged around the bureaucracy if it's connectivity related, ping-ponged around if we're talking about language and culture preservation and the use of technology there, our jurisdictional rights to education, Indigenous people's right to educate Indigenous peoples, and also jurisdiction over our healthcare and the use of technology there. So in working with different levels of government, we get siloed into those colonial structures. And what the idea of this framework is for us to come forward with a holistic vision of how we'd like to see this move forward, hopefully breaking down some of those silos that we've been experiencing. So I think I'll just leave it there, and if there's any questions that I can answer about our approach or what we've been thinking about. I also haven't been able to look at the chat box, so I apologize if I've missed anything.
No, thank you so much, Denise. I really appreciate that, and that was a fantastic overview. I'll give us a pause right now to check for any questions in the chat, and I also want to thank Danae for putting in for recognizing the land on which she's watching this from, which is the Nez Perce tribe in north central Idaho of the US. So I'd be really curious to hear where other participants are calling in from, recognizing the traditional land where they are, as well as any other questions you may have for Denise.
Thanks, Katie.
Okay, we may have some typers. So why don't we put a pin in it for just a minute? And I'm realizing we're tighter on time than I had realized. So I'm going to pass it over to Jeff, and then I'll keep an eye on the chat. And thank you very much, Yola, for letting us know you're from the Piikani Nation in the Blackfoot Confederacy. I appreciate that. And Denise, thank you again for a great presentation. All right, with that, I turn it to you, Jeff.
Okay. How's my audio?
Sounds good.
Okay, very good. Hishjay, Chukma, everyone. My name is Jeff Blackwell, and I am currently right on the border. I'm in Shawnee, Oklahoma, right on the border between the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and the absentee Shawnee tribe. Here in meetings with several tribes from Oklahoma, and I am just just west of my mother's people, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and just north of my father's people, the Chickasaw Nation. So I keep walking and driving every day here through jurisdictions, through various jurisdictions. And I can appreciate everything that Denise just said. I am constantly reminded of how much we share with our cousins to the north. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on managing the business of a network, of a community-based network, and the fundamentals. After talking with ISOC and Katie, some fundamentals of the Federal Communications Commission in Indian country. I work as the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel for Ameren Risk Management. Ameren is an insurance company. It's actually an insurance company that's owned by about 400 tribal nations in the United States. And about half a year after I came to Ameren, we started a little broadband division. And folks asked me, why is Ameren starting a little broadband division? I said, well, because we can. And so we've gotten involved with a number of our tribes, helping them in various ways. My background, I'm a two-time recovering former federal official. I worked as a senior attorney manager at the FCC, at the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, D.C. And about 4 years ago, achieved escape velocity from the Beltway and moved back to the sunny Southwest in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And every day go to work on the Pueblo of Santa Ana in New Mexico. So I'm going to try to move through a few slides. I'm reminded by looking at Scott and Denise's PowerPoints how much respect I have for folks who are so much better at doing PowerPoints than I am. But hopefully I can give you some basics here and then provide a little bit of a framework and a perspective. Somewhat at the 25,000 foot view, and then try to answer some questions as well. I suppose I should also say, excuse me, now that I am back working in Indian country, I co-chair the Economic, Finance, and Community Development Committee of the National Congress of American Indians. It's the largest and oldest intertribal government body in the United States. And I also co-chair with a very good friend to the movement here, Matt Rantanen from the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. I co-chair the Technology and Telecommunications Subcommittee. I did that before for 5 years in between two stints at the FCC. I was the first enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe to ever work at the FCC. And my second time around at the FCC, I helped the FCC start its Office of Native Affairs and Policy. So happy to try to answer any of those questions. And Scott, what can I say about net neutrality? We can get into that. That's a whole nother webinar. So the FCC was actually started in 1934, and one of the impetuses for it was actually the sinking of the Titanic. It was determined that even though it took 4 hours for that boat to sink, that one of the major challenges was interference in the frequencies around the public safety. So one of the recommendations to the United States Congress was to create a Federal Radio Bureau, which is still the oldest part of the FCC, the Media Bureau. The first time it received its major overhaul of its authorization was in '96. It regulates interstate and international commercial communications. And a few little factoids. It is the third smallest of all the major federal agencies, for what that's worth, but 1,500 employees regulate about 1/5 of the gross national product in the United States, and therefore have a great deal to say. Those folks have a great deal to say about the digital divide in Indian country and how it can and should be closed. It's also the very deep end of the pool in terms of regulations in Washington, D.C., the 7th largest producer of regulations in the federal space in the United States. So there, if you break it down, the FCC's primary areas of responsibility to be aware of if you're building a community-based network is that the FCC licenses, the FCC subsidizes, and the FCC regulates economically, meaning that it does not have grants or loans, but that it creates the rules by which regulated entities and unregulated entities as well provide and compete. So it manages all the license spectrum for commercial users and non-commercial users, including local governments, and for public safety, commercial, non-commercial, fixed and mobile wireless services, broadcast, TV and radio, and satellite. And I think the services that you're using there, Scott, in New York City, they also have to comply with FCC rules, even though it's not necessarily a regulated telco endeavor that you're under.
They definitely have to comply. We try to change around things on the edges where and when we can, but that's strictly between us.
Well, very good. Let me reiterate, I'm a former FCC senior attorney. One very important piece to the tribal nations of the United States is when it comes to the way that the FCC creates its policies. In 2000, the FCC recognized the formal government-to-government relationship that it shares with tribal nations, and it created its own tribal policy statement, which outlines the responsibility that the agency has to work at a government-to-government level with tribes. And that has that is a very powerful tool of decision-making for the FCC when it chooses to pick it up and fashion things with it. So the FCC is led by a chairman and 4 commissioners. I've had the opportunity to work for and with 5 chairs, 2 acting chairs, and a dozen of commissioners, advising them on federal Indian law and policy. There are 3 that come from the ruling party at any given time. The current leadership is Ajit Pai, Michael Riley, Brendan Carr, Jessica Rosenworcel, and Jeffrey Starks. And Ajit Pai is the current chairman of the FCC. So the way that the commission is organized is really along the lines of either a particular segment of industry or a particular mission of the agency. So my former bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, it's pretty obvious. The International Bureau regulates satellite, for instance. In particular, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau is kind of the heavy lifter when it comes to licensing wireless services. And then the Wireline Competition Bureau is the heavy lifter when it comes to the Universal Service Fund. And I should have mentioned Universal Service Fund on a couple slides earlier, but I have a slide on it here in a minute. There are a dozen other offices at the commission. It is rare that the offices will coordinate broadly across an issue. Net neutrality, for instance, is one of them. I had the great fortune when I worked at the FCC to work with virtually all of these offices because tribal issues pervade the commission. Whereas the FCC used to see that it was used to think of Native affairs as being a very small issue. Now it sees that it is everywhere. That Native issues exist everywhere in the agency, and present challenges from time to time for them. The Office of Native Affairs and Policy is the central focal point of the FCC for working with tribal nations. It was created to ensure robust government-to-government consultation with tribal nations, to work and advise all of the commissioners, the commission's bureaus and offices, and to develop policies to assist tribal communities. It exists to elevate tribal voices and to be the support mechanism for an advisory body to the FCC that's comprised of tribal leaders, both elected officials and administrative officials. The FCC Native Nations Communications Task Force, which was formerly, during my time there, known as the Broadband Task Force, the FCC Native Nations Broadband Task Force. That is also comprised of senior officials and leaders from across the FCC. These are important meetings. If one is considering creating a community-based network on tribal lands, the members of that task force are seen as representatives and sources of information, resource to you, and also the meetings are very informative. During the time that I was at the FCC, we had a number of tribal representatives who came to various parts of those meetings to listen in and learn. I'm just going back to a question that was mentioned earlier about development training and educational opportunities, places, just thinking of places to get more information. So this is something that should be obvious and clear to everyone. I borrowed this slide actually from another part of our team at Ameren. But depending on the mission of a tribal nation, it can implicate different elements of federal regulation. So for instance, tribal libraries, tribal healthcare, and tribal education. There are subsidy programs at the FCC and the Universal Service Fund that support those missions. And to become involved in those programs is to take on the regulatory challenge of meeting the application process and the reporting processes. When it comes to public safety, of course, the FCC licenses in coordination with the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, licenses public safety frequencies. To the extent that tribal nations are interested in building community networks, and we really do among our 576 tribal nations in the United States, we have folks at every sort of step along the entire spectrum of development. We have 10 fully regulated sort of traditional broadband voice and internet telcos, if you will, to everything in terms of like an IT department on steroids that is operating as a WISP. There are also variations within tribal nations in that there might be a public safety department in a tribal nation that has an independent sort of regulatory relationship with the FCC, a little bit separate and apart, but through the tribal government. So I'm going to linger on this for a minute because I said that the FCC does three things, and it doesn't have grants or loans, but it does administer $11 billion a year in subsidies. So it is, and this money does not come from appropriated taxes in the United States. This comes from licensing fees and a fee that all of us pay on our interstate telecom bills. The two that are probably going sort of in order here, excuse me, going a little bit out of order. The largest of these programs is the high cost program. Now that is a program that provides capital and operational support for fully regulated telecom companies in the United States. So a community-based network necessarily might not be looking at high cost to begin with. The other programs, depending on how the rules develop and depending on sort of the play, if you will, of the community-based network, become more relevant. Probably the next in terms of its of being, let's say, the Lifeline program is a program that provides subsidized services to low-income families. Again, one must be a regulated entity. The Commission did adopt rules for a Lifeline-only based supported service. It has not, however, granted a certification for that in the last 5 years, I believe. Should that program come alive, that could, depending on the type of network, that the type of deployment of service, a Lifeline only based eligible telecommunications carrier could be possible for a community-based network. That would be a network of a little bit higher order, but there is a special tribal program there now that has been the focus of a lot of conjecture among the Commission. And it is a program that is currently under fire. So we're watching to see what happens with the Lifeline program, and there are many commenters and many involved that are defending the tribal Lifeline program. Recently, the Commission redefined and put in a population density requirement. They redefined the definition of tribal lands and put in a population density requirement. The two programs that are probably more relevant, particularly for the creation of something of a backbone for community-based networks, are the Schools and Libraries program, the famous E-rate program, which clocks in at the end of the last funding year at $3.9 billion. And then by far the smallest program, but one that I'm very hopeful for, one that I actually never got my hands on while I was at the FCC, the Rural Healthcare Program. The Schools and Libraries program, for the vast majority of its existence, covered the installation of Wi-Fi in schools and libraries. It always had the potential to cover outside plant expenditures, but it wasn't until the program was updated under the previous administration that the potential to cover long-haul fiber runs was created in E-rate. And I have a slide later on a project that we did a year ago. And then Rural Healthcare is a program that has telecoms services as well. And it is for eligible rural healthcare providers. And it is a program that supports the vast majority of the network in Alaska to hundreds of Alaska Native villages. I put a little note at the bottom of this slide. I am hopeful that the Commission, in 2011 into 2012, the Commission created the Mobility Fund, and they just finished last year phase 2 of the Mobility Fund. In phase 1 of the Mobility Fund, there was a tribal mobility fund. Unfortunately, in phase 2, there was not, but I'm hopeful that the Commission could return in its modernization of the high cost program. Essentially, the way the Mobility Fund worked is there was a portion of high cost that was created the subsidy was made available as a reverse auction, and bidders came in to bid on how to cover different eligible areas, and there were large parts of Indian country that were eligible, and about $50 million was distributed to companies. Unfortunately, not enough of it to tribal nations or community-based networks, but to carriers that would provide in those areas. So that's a snapshot of universal service. It is, as I said before, it really is the deep end of the pool for a community-based network. But when it comes to schools and libraries and rural healthcare, it's something that I think everyone should consider the potential of. So when I was talking with Katie, we had a conversation about wireless services, and this really scratches a wireless services licensing in the FCC. And this slide really sort of scratches the very top level, the highest level of what happens when one becomes a licensee at the FCC, particularly a licensee of regulated spectrum. So at its very core, holding a license at the FCC is a requirement to comply with the purposes of the license, and that includes geographic boundaries. We have a number of tribal nations that are very interested in obtaining licensed spectrum, and most recently the Commission has come out with what a lot of people are talking about right now, a tribal priority in 2.5 gigahertz for educational broadband services. It is a service that is it's an older service that actually was an amount of spectrum that could be utilized for television to deliver educational broadcast to schools. And it has been underutilized for its history. And the Commission recently adopted rules that actually I worked on along with a number of folks 8 years ago that we had to set down while other things were happening at the Commission. They just got picked up, and I was very, very happy to see that the Commission put into those rules a tribal priority, sort of a first person in line opportunity for tribal nations wanting to get a portion of those frequencies above their own land. But to step back sort of at the beginning, to become a licensee at the FCC and to conduct business with the FCC, you must first register with CORS, Commission Registration System. It automatically provides a community network with a FCC registration number. That identifies you to the FCC. That becomes your sort of calling card with the FCC. Dozens and dozens and dozens of times I would have to ask for carriers' FRNs, particularly when there were carriers that were participating in spectrum auctions or other kind of licensing or adjudicatory matters. The commission has a few databases that I recommend folks become familiar with. ULS, the Universal Licensing System, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you know your way around that, you can find just about any license out there. The antenna structure registration database is a database where all equipment that is related to a regulated service is kept. This becomes particularly important when we're talking about environmental concerns for siting. And one database that I was reminded about when I was doing a little bit of background research and homework on preparing for this, the OET Experimental Licensing System. There have been a few community-based networks that have received experimental licenses from the FCC. I was very fortunate to be a part of a project when I was last at the FCC. We granted a experimental license to a wireless carrier so they could work with the Yurok tribe on the lower Klamath River in Northern California and throw a signal up and down about 40 miles of the Klamath River and prove that there is a market there. After that experimental license matured and ended, the Yurok, the Hupa, and the Karuk tribes coordinated to create a community, what is essentially a community-based backbone network. And then two other systems to become familiar with if you're considering going sort of a more regulated route. The Tower Construction Notification System, which is a uniquely expensive and detailed system that supports the work of state historic preservation officers and tribal cultural preservation officers. Wherever a tower that will be a commercial tower or a tower that involves a licensed service at the FCC, wherever those towers are to be sited, that site needs to be reviewed under the National Historic Preservation Act. I have a slide a little bit later on that. The Tower Construction Notification System in a double-blind manner notifies, the FCC requires carriers to populate the system, and in a double-blind manner, it automatically notifies tribes where they have indicated their areas of interest. So for instance, if somebody, where I'm sitting right now in Shawnee, Oklahoma, if somebody were to site a tower, it is very likely that there would be a number of tribes that potential input on the system would automatically notify for a review. And then there's a new voluntary online system. It's not that new. It's actually about 4 or 5 years old. The E106 system, which supports these environmental reviews.
And sorry, Jeff, I'm going to hop in just really quick.
Sure.
We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So participants, if you have questions, as you're thinking about them, it'd be really helpful if you could put them in the chat. And that way we'll use the last few minutes and just read them back to back and answer them all at once. So thanks, Jeff. Keep going.
Well, let me try to fly through these so we can have a few minutes. So when it comes, I already mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act. It's a required review that federal law requires for the FCC to provide the opportunity for tribes to review any impact on sites of religious and cultural significance, and the states the opportunity to review historic properties. Of course, the National Environmental Policy Act applies. It is a light touch from the FCC. You don't see a lot of infrastructure that is sited in places like where there might be flooding or other environmental concerns. Local rights-of-way and permitting is a big issue for backhaul. I'm reminded when I look at Scott's slides of how very different remote parts of what we call Indian country in the United States are. And here's a list of the entities that can be involved if you're looking for rights-of-way or land use permitting. Of course, the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs, which has its own valuation process for rights of way. Other federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, tribal government states, cities, towns, and municipalities, and even we've had to engage in some interactions with railroads who think they own large parts of the United States, and in fact do, actually. There are also regulatory considerations in terms of co-locating on existing towers or other antenna facilities. There is a co-location process at the FCC that streamlines the siting of wireless antennas and repeaters. And also there is a process, although we are hoping that the FCC will take action on a rulemaking to overhaul it, a secondary markets licensing process to either partition or disaggregate, sublease, if you will, wireless spectrum, commercial wireless spectrum. A couple pretty slides. I thought I could throw some in here. This is a project that involved 2 separate consortiums of 6 pueblos in central New Mexico. That is actually a picture of the fiber, E-rate fiber, being trenched along the Pueblo of Cochiti as it is heading south into the Pueblo of Santa Ana. This is in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, New Mexico, on Pueblo land, connecting several schools and libraries. What is significant about this network is that the rules, the plans allowed for, while the trenches were open, the tribes to put in their own conduit so that they could have what they term sovereign fiber. And large portions of this network are self-provisioned. They do, through some leased fiber, hook into the Gigapop in Albuquerque. This is an exciting opportunity. It's the first time that the fiber rules at the FCC were used by tribal nations. And if you look in the middle on the right, Santa Ana, that's it is on that reservation where the Ameren offices are. So this happened in our own backyard. We're working with tribes or this division of ours, excuse me, this division that I help oversee. I don't work in it, but I donate them a lot of time, working with tribes in several other parts of the United States, including Minnesota, Alaska, Arizona, California. A number of folks are looking at various different things. I wish I had something a little bit more ground level so you could juxtapose directly with Scott's. If you're looking at the bottom of this, and that's the Rio Grande Valley, and just thinking about the number of rights of way and easements and number of sort of regulatory touches, this project involved a number of them at all of the levels that we talked about that I mentioned earlier. Let me just go through a couple more slides, pictures. And I think, yes, here we are. We're at the end. Contact information for me and for Ameren Critical Infrastructure. And there you go. I'm done. Hopefully we can get back to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff. First of all, I want to say I really appreciate that. That was a very, very helpful overview of everything, and I'm really excited to have those slides on the website as well, because I think they'll be a great reference to go back to. So I'll pause for just a second, and participants, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I also see that Danae put in a comment while you were chatting as well, and said that she's currently the co-chair for the Native Nations Communications Task Force, and she also sits as the chair for the FirstNet Tribal Working Group, who is building out a U.S. public safety communications network that will provide, as a subsequent benefit, broadband and commercial cellular service. So, Danae, thanks very much for putting that in the chat too. I really appreciate it, and hope that participants will be able to reach out to you as well. So I'll pause there for just a second.
So Katie, if I may, Danae Wilson is a wonderful resource. She and I developed a relationship long distance from Washington to where she is at Nez Perce Tribe in northern Idaho. And she's got a wealth of experience, not only just running her IT department and working with local telcos to create their network, but also on the national stage advocating for tribal policies. And it's impressive to see the growth that's happening in the Northwest I'm not sure if it's because of their proximity to Seattle, but there are a number of tribes that are very active up there. So it's good to see Danae on the call.
Absolutely. Okay. Danae says, thanks for the kind words. Well, Danae, we're very happy to have you on, so appreciate it a lot. And for those of you that missed it, Danae was also on a session early on in the trainings, and there's a webinar on the website, or a recording on the website. So you can check that out there, and that also means that she's on the listserv along with your other facilitators from today. So if you have questions afterward, please feel free to send them there, and the facilitators will see them. I also want to say that I think a lot of the questions I sometimes get in the private chat, I really do think the whole group benefits from. So please feel free to send those out. It's really helpful to have that discussion going in the chat and on the listserv. So, all right, I'm going to give it one more second. And then since we're right up on time, actually, I guess we're right at time now. So if you do have additional questions, I'll ask that you send them on the listserv or to me, and I'll pass them to the right people. And one more time, I want to say thank you so much to our facilitators. That was really helpful, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you all more soon.
Thanks so much for including me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to our participants for joining. We'll talk to you soon.